This motherfucker eating beans.
Yeah, literally. Speaking of eating beans.
Speaking of eating beans, see, the segue would have worked a lot better when we were talking about hot dogs and sausages.
Well, speaking of proteins contained within a metal container.
Because we're talking about the U.S. Navy today.
Yes, another big dumb boat.
Actually, the boat immaterial to the story.
Oh.
It does take place on said boat, but the boat is unimportant here.
Okay.
Because we're talking about a mutiny, one of our favorite things that can happen aboard a ship. And the one time we tried to cover one before, a show way bigger than us steamrolled us and covered the exact same thing at the exact same time. What are the odds that happens a second time, Tom?
But we did it better.
Of course we did.
Because we are the best.
We're the only military history podcast.
We are the only military history podcast about military failures from a left-wing perspective. There you go.
And if you are not a military historian and you step into my territory, well, there's not anything I could do about it. So there's that. But Tom, generally when we talk about ship-based uprisings and mutinies, they're a thing of the past. They're a bit antiquated. The era of when, the world was much bigger than it is today, when ships could leave port and you pretty much only knew how they were doing when they eventually showed back up where they were supposed to be going.
Mm-hmm.
Because of this, and because the relative youth of the United States as a concept, this tends to be something that people just don't think of when you think of the U.S. Navy. But you would be wrong in thinking that the U.S. Navy had never experienced a mutiny. Well, kind of. But we'll get to that.
I'm going to say the level of mutinies experienced by the navies in the U.S. particularly is inversely proportionate to the invention of the Newport. It's much easier to squash a mutiny if you can just give them a pack of Newports and tell them to go smoke on the deck.
I don't even know if they're allowed to smoke on ships anymore. I don't know. I wasn't in the Navy. I know we have listeners who are in the Navy. Tell us about your smoking experience.
No, they're all vaping now. We have Zoomer naval officers that are vaping on the deck.
I know that vapes are banned from some ships, maybe submarines, due to the possibility of lithium-ion battery fires.
Yeah, honestly, I think Navy officers just yearn for the past where everyone was inhaling asbestos insulation on the ships during World War II.
Yeah, it's good for your lungs. It gets them bigger. In fact, a mutiny has happened, kind of, sort of, one time in a very strange event aboard the USS Summers. And I should pause here for a second and explain a few things. A mutiny is an organized event to overthrow the ship's leadership, normally the captain, and take it for themselves. So I know there's been, let's say, acts of sabotage in the Navy, some proven, some alleged, with the most well-known happening back in 2020 when a sailor named Ryan Mays was accused of setting a fire aboard the Bonamy Richard. Everybody saw this on the internet back during COVID. He allegedly set a small fire which ran out of control for several days, ending in the complete destruction of the entire ship. But he was found not guilty, so good for him. That entire case is wild as hell. We'll probably do an episode about it at some point in the future. But the point here is some sailor being really pissed off and allegedly or otherwise breaking some shit is not a mutiny, as much as we all really wish it was, because everybody loves a mutiny, unless, of course, you happen to be the captain of the ship, in which case you're going to have a really bad day.
Yeah, conceptually, a mutiny, as we are talking about, is a coordinated overthrow of command on a ship.
Yeah, exactly. I would argue that, say, maybe to the shock of people who don't know any better, maybe don't have no connection to the military at all, as a former enlisted guy, occasionally doing some light damage to something to get out of work, at war or otherwise, is something of a proud military tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I can explain this further without copping to some arguably serious crimes. So we're going to move on.
Just in your mind, think of a mutiny as a wet coup d'etat.
That's correct. Yeah, it's a moist coup. I don't like that, Tom. I don't like that. Anyway, I hope everybody likes the debut album of my band, Moist Coup.
Who up moistening they captain.
With that, let's talk about the USS Summers. The Summers was launched in 1842, back in the era before the U.S. was a power of really anything at all. And specifically, the Navy was dealing with serious manpower shortages. But this is also taking place in a time when the U.S. Navy was trapped in that middle zone between tradition and modernization. So for that reason, the Summers would have two missions, one making the other one kind of insane. So by the mid-1800s, the U.S. Navy had established what was known as the Africa Squadron, which is an ominous sentence if I've ever said one. Now, the squadron's job was an anti-slavery patrol to stop American flag ships from smuggling slaves back to the United States. And I know what you're thinking. Slavery was still legal in America at the time, and you are correct. But the importation of slaves was not legal. That became illegal back in 1807 and did not do a single fucking thing to address the domestic slave trade.
Yeah, it's a bit like when they banned jewels. It was like the jewels are already on the market, they can be sold, but you can't make more jewels. I know we're talking about the trade of enslaved people and being a little bit glib about it, but the metaphor works.
Point to Tom. Now, this law never stopped anybody from smuggling slaves. The slaves instead were generally just landed in Florida or Texas, which I know is apt for modern day Florida and Texas, but at the time they were controlled by Spain. Then they were smuggled overland into the U.S. Even though by 1820, slave smuggling was supposed to be a capital offense in the United States, nobody was ever punished for this shit. Not really. Tens of thousands of, I'm going to say smuggled slaves, because saying the word illegal slaves is something of a hat on a hat to me. But tens of thousands of smuggled slaves made it into the United States every year. Anyway, America was founded on violence is terrible. Moving on.
Yeah, but our flag is about heritage, Joe.
That's right. That's right. Heritage, not hate. Yeehaw!
That rebel flag has fringe on it. I will not be tried in an Admiralty racist court.
So the USS Summers' job would be relaying messages all the way from the United States to the USS Vandalia, which was stationed to the Africa Squadron, which in turn generally was ported at Liberia. If being the Navy mailman sounds bad enough, and it does sound like a pretty shitty job, who was staffing the ship made the ship's mission about 1 million times worse. So in 1842, the U.S. Naval Academy, commonly known as Annapolis, did not exist yet. And it wouldn't until what we're going to talk about happened. That meant the U.S. Navy relied on the same system a lot of other places did when it came to staffing its Navy: apprenticeships. These apprentices were normally teenagers, learning on the job and taught by senior sailors who had come up the same way. Commanding them would be officers who had largely also gone through the same process. Officer apprentices were known as midshipmen because of where they slept on the ship, and it is today what cadets at the Naval Academy are still known as. Really, the only difference between officers and sailors within the U.S. Navy was not an education, even a professional education, since it really didn't exist yet, but rather one group came from money and the other one did not.
That's almost like, you know, the structure of the U.S. military today of officers and NCOs.
Not really. I can only speak for the U.S. Army, but like there's really no class system in the U.S. Army between officers and enlisted men, especially not between enlisted men and NCOs. Like, because enlisted men go on to become NCOs if you stay on long enough and can count to 10, like myself. But like, because it's so much easier to get a commission as a normal person within the U.S. Army, and there's no foundational class divide, that is kind of not a thing there. I'm not going to say that some officers aren't dickheads. Of course they are. But in the Navy specifically, there is a foundational class divide between officers and enlisted men, to the point that some ships have separate staircases for officers. Then like officers' mess is still a thing, like where officers eat separately. Like that just doesn't happen in the Army. That's not me complimenting the Army at all. They just come from two different realities, two different kinds of class consciousness, for a lack of a better term. They're just built differently, but not built differently, parentheses, good, built differently, as in like fuck both of them. I can't really say shit about the Navy. I was not in the Navy. I can from a historical standpoint. The Army is still a deeply diseased organization that has other problems, is what I'm getting at. Class is not the problem that the Army has.